Yes. Greetings. Greetings, everyone. It is Zakele here. Sorry for the little technical glitch here there at the beginning. Seeing as I'm new at the very least in this capacity of hosting, you're usually used to seeing me on the YouTube channel and me telling you about everything liberty. But today, since we are talking about something that is pretty close to my heart and it is international trade, I wanted to take over the reins and just take over the conversation. I'm kidding, I won't be. Instead I am joined by the great academic extraordinaire, let us call him that, Dr. Morné Malan, Senior Associate here at the Free Market Foundation. And we'll pretty much be talking about trade, right? We'll be talking about international trade, but let Morné introduce himself.
Yeah, thank you very much, Zakele. It's an honor to be here. And yeah, it's actually in light of, I think trade hasn't been as relevant as it is now for quite some time. I think given the global hostility surrounding trade, and then in particular the uncertainty surrounding trade between South Africa and our second largest trade partner, the US, it really has enjoyed some renewed focus. And I think that in light of this renewed focus, it really is an opportune time for us to really just ground a bunch of eternal truths that have actually been in the air for quite some time. Uh, since the dawn of economics, actually, the focus has always been on trade. It's always been on the ability of commerce, and in particular, commerce between various nations to enrich one another, to indicate that trade is mutually beneficial to both partners, whether you look at that from the level of a nation or whether you look at that from the level of an individual. Trade is always mutually beneficial. And given the renewed focus, and we just thought it was particularly important now to re-emphasize a lot of these truths that have been empirically and analytically proven throughout the years, because to a large extent, the history of economic thought has been um, almost a forgetting of the initial ground. We gained all this ground in economic theory with the work of Adam Smith, with David Ricardo, others such as Bastiat, and unfortunately, particularly when it comes to trade, a lot of the field has been actually taking a few steps back so that we can take a few steps forward. And yeah, that's why we wrote, as part of the Liberty First initiative, this paper, the paper which focuses on trade, the ability of trade to enrich us, to create prosperity, to create freedom, consumer choice, and eventually jobs. Um, but yeah, to just show that
Yeah.
trade is still the easiest, best, and fastest mechanism to create real prosperity, to create real economic growth, something which South Africa is desperately in need of and has been for over a decade now.
That is true. I think I would not have said it much more better. And for our audience, wherever it is you may be watching us from, this is our second paper. This part of our Liberty First Amplified. If you remember that last year, we actually launched Liberty First, as Morné has mentioned, and he was, a major contributor in that, whereby we pretty much gave the South African state solutions to solving, I don't want to say all our problems, but most of our problems, right? The solutions are there. We invested a whole lot of time in doing that, and we'll be posting the link for that in the chat, most likely either right now or later, so that you can go and check out the Liberty First sites and just see generally where the paper stems from, because Morné wrote the initial paper on international trade, and now he expanded more on some of the recommendations he made within that paper. But Morné, let us get into the meat and potatoes of this. You mentioned that trade is mutually beneficial. This is contrary to what we are seeing in mainstream thought right now, right? The biggest economy in the world is pretty much saying the opposite of that. The jurisdiction that founded, that was part of the founding of institutions like the World Trade Organization and every other, free trade organization you can think of. The United States has always been a proud ambassador of that. But ever since the second Trump presidency, one would say really, even in the first Trump presidency, when we saw the initial trade war with China, we've been seeing the reversal, as you said, of this thinking that trade is mutually beneficial, right? So as a as a beginning and tying into a paper, because I'm sure that you operate upon that premise. I want you to expand a bit more on really why do you think it is that a lot of people have these inclinations? Where do they come from, these inclinations to say that trade is not mutually beneficial, the inclination to protectionism, because we currently live in a protectionist world and currently, and it has created, as you've said, a lot of problems. At least in South Africa, we've always had somewhat of a protected economy, somewhat. So really, I want you to firstly expand on why international trade, free international trade especially, is so important, and especially responding to why a lot of people, especially the highest decision makers in the world, have such an aversion to it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge question, but I
Yeah.
think broadly you can look at various features of the debate. Maybe we should just restate the fact that it has been a feature of economic theory since the dawn of the science that trade is always a mutually beneficial exchange. Otherwise, it wouldn't occur. That's the first point. If one individual would not trade with another individual if it were to their detriment, and that applies to both. Beyond that, it's also been shown that even in circumstances where one country is better than another country or more efficient than another country at producing every single good, it still benefits that country to rather trade with another country than to do everything on their own. And the reason for that is because it allows countries to specialize in what they do best. So not what they do better than other countries, but what they do best relative to themselves. And I should actually just stop myself there because um, another point which I do see people mistaking is the fact that is the notion that people see trade as something that occurs between two nations, between two countries. So when we talk about trade, we talk about trade between South Africa and the US. Now, countries don't really trade with one another. It's not the South African government that's purchasing or exporting automobiles. It's not the US government that's purchasing or exporting agricultural products. It's private businesses. And those private businesses have determined that it's beneficial for them and beneficial for them either to export or to import, and that they'll both reap the benefits of that and be able to reinvest those funds into their own countries. That's just the first point. The reason why I think a lot of people tend to miss this is actually an insight that Bastiat, who I referred to earlier, uh, provided, a French economist. He pointed to the unseen versus the seen effects of economic policy. And here, together with that, you can also add the notion of concentrated versus diffuse benefits and harms. But first, let's just talk about the seen versus the unseen. Um, when you do have protectionist policy, what you see is maybe a particular industry, call it the steel industry, call it the textile industry. Those are usually the two uh, most prominent ones, or even the automotive industry. It does benefit those industries to be protected. It does protect them from foreign competition. It does entrench or guard against any competition, and it actually enables them to monopolize a sector. So those are very tangible, very concentrated benefits, and they're seen. What's not seen is the effect that it has on the rest of the economy. So it doesn't show us how the protection of one industry negatively impacts all of the various industries that have, say, steel or textiles or anything really, as they use that as an input. Um, it harms those industries, but there are many more of those industries, and they might even be smaller than one large industry, such as the steel industry, or where there is a very high concentration in the market. So it's very tangible, very visible, concentrated benefits. And on the other hand, there are these almost unseen effects that are so dispersed in the economy that people can't really they struggle to acknowledge those. But the fact is that the overall effect is still enormously harmful to the economy. And the other point there is just the fact that um, it's also the potential harm that's cost that, or not the potential harm, but the potential investment that it deters. Something that we've seen in South Africa is that we've had an enormous dip in foreign direct investment, and also even domestic investment. The private sector isn't investing in the South African economy because they don't have any reliable prospects that they'll be able to generate a return on that investment. And until we get to a point where we allow companies, and again, that's companies, individuals, to be able to take their lot, take the outcomes of their decisions into their own hands, and to not interfere with that, people are not going to be willing to risk their own capital if the returns on that capital is merely subject to the will or the whims of a particular bureaucrat, whether that bureaucrat sits in Pretoria or whether that bureaucrat sits in Washington D.C. The fact is that the only thing a government can do is that governments can do is step in the way of trade between companies, individuals, or what have
Mhm.
you, but
Amazing,
they
amazing.
can't facilitate trade in any meaningful
Themselves.
respect.
Ah, I love that whole idea that groups cannot act in and of themselves. As individualists, we like such sound reasoning. And also, you mentioned Bastiat, so you are always gonna be invited to my pride. But moving on to really the what you wrote about in your paper, which I think ties well to what you just mentioned right now about how there are certain effects that are not considered by people or that are unseen, right? In your paper, you mentioned the three main points upon which protectionism is argued for, and then you argued against that. And to me, as we're speaking earlier on, it was a very mind blowing experience. I hardly ever get mind blown when reading papers, so thank you for that. But it was mind blowing to see it explained in that manner, which shows, how geopolitical considerations for protectionism or the protection of local industries as is really much prevalent all across the world, or the generation of revenue, as President Donald
Mm.
Trump would say, that other people will be paying for the tariffs. All of these really are all three are used to motivate for higher tariffs and general protectionist attitudes. But please, since you are the one who introduced the idea, please expand more on that.
Yeah, no, definitely. If we could maybe just get that slide up. And this was actually inspired by the US President Trump himself, because he does tend to refer to any possible effect or any possible goal of tariffs or of trade protectionist policies. uh, any possible benefit, he pretends as though you can have all of them at the same time, and it's quite clear that beyond the fact that these are inefficient in and of themselves, they also are mutually exclusive, and that's just the point that we want to make here. Is the arguments in favor of tariffs are basically three. It's either we can generate tax revenue, uh, which is simple enough. And in that case, it becomes basically just a kind of a consumption tax, the equivalent of a VAT. Um, but that's the one argument. The other argument is to protect your local industries, usually a reference to so-called infant industries. Here, the notion is that we have a burgeoning industry that just isn't quite strong enough to compete. But if we just protect it from foreign contest for some time, it will be able to stand on its own at a later time. Now, the problem with those infant industries in the first place is just, or in and of themselves, is that they just tend to never grow up. So when you protect an infant industry, it tends to stay an infant industry for in perpetuity. And then the final point, the final argument, or the purported goal of tariffs, is that you have some sort of geopolitical strategy that you're trying to accomplish. Now, the three main characteristics of trade policy are: is the tariff rate going to be stable? how high or how low will the tariff rate be? So the severity of the tariff rate. And then what impact are you expecting to have on imports? Tariffs are a tax on imports. So uh, you may or may not want to have an impact on imports when you're instituting a tariff. And what the following uh, graph shows is that these three cannot, well, these three are mutually exclusive. In fact, they're not just mutually exclusive, they are mutually hostile to one another. If your hope is to generate revenue, you want a tax rate or tariff rate that is going to be very stable, because if you're a government and you're hoping to rely on tariffs to fund the government, then you can't change that rate too much. So it has to be stable. It also has to be low. You can't have too high a tariff rate. And the reason for that is because if the tariff rate is too high, then you'll be impacting imports, which you don't want to do. If you are hoping to generate tax revenue, you actually want imports to increase, because the more you import, the more tax revenue you're going to get. So that's if you're trying to generate tax revenue. On the other hand, if you're trying to protect local industry, you actually want a very high tariff rate. You also want it to be stable. So they do have that in common with the revenue generation point. You want it to be a stable tariff rate. Also on this side, not so the government can do their planning, but so that your local producers can do their planning. If the rate's constantly changing, then they can't really rely on the fact that they can't make investment, they can't allocate capital if they have no reliance on the stability of the tariff rate. Where they diverge is on the other 2 points. They want to generate protection. You want a high tariff rate because you do want to impact imports. You want to discourage imports because you want to protect your industry. You want the domestic market to make use of local producers as opposed to international producers. So there's already a huge influence or incongruity between those two. On the one hand, if you want to generate revenue, you're encouraging imports. On the other hand, if you're hoping to protect your local industry, you can't also rely on it being on it generating revenue, because you don't want imports to take place. The last point is the geopolitical, what I've called here, power. And this is another one of the points that President Trump often emphasizes, or at least his supporters and the people in his administration emphasize, and that's that you're using tariffs basically as a negotiating ploy in order to get some other concession. This, once again, is incompatible and, in fact, hostile to the other goals, because rather than having a stable tariff rate, you want it to be very unstable, because you want to be able to leverage it in order to negotiate. So it can be high if you want to get a concession, and it can be low once you've gotten a concession, but it can't be stable. It has to be flexible. Similarly, you want, likewise with the rate. So it's unstable, and the rate is variable as well, because you sometimes want it to be high, sometimes want it to be low. But more than that, more than the fact that it's unstable and there's a variable rate, you actually don't want to have much protection if you're trying to exercise geopolitical power. You also don't want to have much reliance on revenue if you're trying to exercise geopolitical power, because both of those things limit your flexibility as a government. If you have a bunch of local producers reliant upon protection, that means you can't take it away. You don't have the power to remove a tariff in order to get a concession or some other political concession. Similarly, if the government is reliant upon revenue, you also don't have that flexibility to lower a rate or to raise a rate in order to negotiate more freely with an external force. And the point there is just that regardless of which of these goals you're hoping to accomplish, it's already a bad idea. Revenue is, if you're hoping to generate revenue through tariffs, it's the equivalent of a less efficient VAT. It's just a consumption tax, but with greater distortionary effect on economic activity. If you're hoping to protect your industries, it also reallocates capital and distorts prices, so that you get money allocated as opposed to where it's most efficient, rather where the best lobbyists are, the people with the best connections to government. And geopolitical power, again, um, it's a I mean, I suppose that one's open for debate whether or not it's the most effective means there. But the fact is, you're undermining a lot of other facets of your economy in order to accomplish that particular goal. So that's just to say that, particularly, message to President Trump there and the U.S. government, that you really can't have all of these at the same time. And you likely don't want to use tariffs or to mess with trade in order to achieve any one of them, in any case.
Mhm. I mean, great explanation. I hope at the very least this has spawned questions among those who are watching us, because it is some pretty interesting stuff. Because I think you mentioned a very interesting point, that politicians, especially one, the most prominent one being Donald Trump, who do this a lot. They always argue for protectionism using all 3 points combined. They will say tariffs will protect local industries, and tariffs are good show of power that you won't be taken advantage of, and that tariffs will also generate revenue for the state, which the state is always in need of. And I like you having explained how, each one on their own is pretty problematic. And as you say, the power aspect is truly subject to debate. But I think, as you mentioned in your paper, is that the geopolitics aspect, or really every other aspect of this, is an economic policy that does not take into consideration the economic consequences of whatever it is that they're
Mm.
dealing with. So it is pretty unfortunate, because this is the, I want to say, status quo that politicians have created all across the world. And when you interrogate it as you start to see the holes in it. And we only hope that we will have a much more freer world, at least a person who wants a freer world after reading your paper. But moving on to another aspect of your paper, we've been talking about problems quite a lot. I want us to move on to what you propose are the solutions to these problems, right? Beyond the very interesting theoretical stuff you just did right now. I cannot overstate how great that is. But we want to know the actual solutions. I think Liberty First is a solution-oriented project in general, and your paper was specifically focused on solutions for the South African economy. Please tell us more about those.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the first point that we had to emphasize was the fact that, and there's actually there's a quote for, I think it's 1937, from the British economist Joan Robinson, which is thinking that you can institute tariffs, or thinking that free trade is all well and good, as long as everybody else is also practicing free trade, but that you should retaliate against tariffs when one of your partners institutes them, is the equivalent of saying, because some other nation has a rocky shore, then the only reasonable response is for us to throw a bunch of rocks into our harbors as well. Fact is, you are going to harm it. And the point that we're just making there is that domestic tariffs have harmed our economy for years upon years now, decades in fact, and thinking that in any case a retaliatory tariff, or even just a purported retaliatory tariff, as in the case of the US, is going to benefit your country economically, is folly in and of itself. So that's the first point: is that the correct response isn't to retaliate, and luckily our government has been quite clear on that point so far. Um, well, I think partially also based on the fact that we can only do so much harm by retaliating, but the fact is we can do a lot of harm to ourselves by retaliating. So the first point is just to not retaliate. Some other points, and this is trade policy broadly, and we've divided these up into three different categories: immediate actions, structural reforms, and legislative interventions. Now, immediate actions, there are 2 points there. First of all, we say repeal all tariffs instituted since 2019. These are tariffs that haven't been in for as long. There's not as much reliance upon them. They're relatively new in the greater scheme of things, which means that we should be able to repeal them without doing too much harm to industries. And of those existing tariffs that still exist after that repeal, we're saying institute a sunset clause. It's a 5-year sunset clause that gives enough time to producers to not get their affairs in order, but to plan around the repeal of those tariffs, and to say that rather than, and because this is also what we've seen in the US, rather than vesting that tariff, the ability to institute tariffs in the executive, have the ability to institute tariffs, have that be subject to a parliamentary vote. We've seen the damage that uncertainty can do on a global level when you're as big as the US, but it also happens on a domestic level when you don't have a very you actually want government to move fairly slowly with these sorts of things. You don't want them to be too effective when it comes to massive economic or to decisions with massive economic implications. So those are the two immediate things we can do, neither of which should require very much, and yeah, could be done relatively quickly with maybe some small harm in the short term, but huge benefits in the long term. Regarding structural reforms, and I'm going to go a little bit quicker here as well, so that we can, so we don't take up too much time, and so that we can also get to some of the questions. Structural reforms. First thing is we're saying abolish ITAC. That's the International Trade Administration Commission. It's at the moment its mandate is to ensure what's called fair trade. Now, fair trade is whatever the people of ITAC feels is fair. You can see how any term like that can be distorted, and you can see it the way in which it's being distorted in the US in particular. But they're not unique in this case. Plenty of countries use this notion of fair trade merely as a means of saying that, in principle, we support free trade, but it would be unfair if we actually did it. And so abolish the ITAC and replace it with a commission that's mandated explicitly to lower trade barriers. Trade, as we've said, is good. Trade benefits everyone. Trade attracts investment. Trade lowers prices. It's going to increase the purchasing power of South Africans. It's going to make our own industries more effective, more efficient, because they have cheap access to cheaper inputs. So trade is good, more is better. It's basically that point. It's also why we're saying legislative presumption in favor of free trade, which means that except by parliamentary approval, it's going to be presumed to be a illegal or an unlawful act whenever trade is interfered with. Streamline the customs system. This is particularly important in Singapore, or there's a particularly good model in Singapore. Streamline those customs systems. You can digitalize a lot of it. You can cut a lot of the compliance costs associated with trade. And it really are these almost intangible regulatory effects often have a far larger impact than people realize. People tend to focus on taxes, but often compliance and regulation is massively outweighs the impact on economic activity versus mere taxation, because taxation is at least somewhat consistent. Finally, we need to liberalize capital controls in order to attract foreign direct investment. Our capital controls are absolutely ridiculous. Government has, in its own white papers, acknowledged this for years upon years. Many of these capital controls are still a vestige of the previous apartheid government. They were a bad idea then. They're still a bad idea now, and they are discouraging foreign direct investment. And again, you can see that in the fact that we don't have gross fixed capital formation in South Africa. We don't have economic growth, and because of that, we don't have economic growth, which means we don't have we have one of, if not in fact, the highest unemployment rate in the world. And we are deindustrializing as a country. We are moving away from a lot of those key industries that have been vital in order to create jobs. And then finally, on the legislative side, we're saying enshrine economic liberty and trade openness as constitutional principles. There should be a recognition that the freedom to exchange, the freedom to what Adam Smith called to truck, barter, and exchange is a natural human propensity. People want to engage in commerce. It is a basic human right, and it should be recognized as such in our constitution.
Mm, I mean, yeah. And then we will have some people who will come and say there are no solutions when, we just had a rundown of what I think are pretty in-depth solutions right there. Particularly, I like, the division in making it clear that there are, actually immediate solutions that the government can just implement right now and try and improve the situation. And for me, as a free trade proponent, I am what many on the left would call a free market fundamentalist. I am all for removing all trade barriers. So I like the non-retaliation point and saying that just because someone, is messing up their own house doesn't mean that you have to follow them and do the same too, especially given our position, as you've mentioned, no growth due to no fixed capital formation and as such resulting in one of the highest unemployment rates in the world. But if to anyone watching us, if you are interested, please, you can probably see the link of the paper on the screen right there. Go to the chat, click on the link, and read the paper. It is a great paper. Please do give yourself time to read that, and especially given the global context of what is currently happening right now concerning protectionism and international trade. Being informed about these issues means that it won't be easy for politicians to dribble you when they want to do that. So yeah, please do check it out. And now we want to move on to the questions. We hope that you've been engaging in the chat, and we want to move on to see what you've been thinking, because I'm sure that there's some pretty interesting, at least tidbits of conversation we can have right there. I see there's a question from Dick Kotsia, who's asking, why has it been possible for all of the sub-Saharan countries been able to negotiate no more than 15% tariffs, while the largest economy in Africa gets 30%? So pretty much asking, why is it that South Africa seems to be the black sheep of sub-Saharan Africa, even though we happen to have one of the biggest economies in Africa, we have a pretty sophisticated financial services sector and all of those things. But yeah, to you, Morné.
Yeah, I think that just maybe before we start on that, it's first of all, I'm not entirely sure that we're still the biggest economy in Africa. I think on a per
Oh,
capita basis, we're still relatively high up, but we certainly are a sophisticated economy. We certainly do have those the financial sector that you referenced, which is very sophisticated. The financial markets in South Africa, in not just actually in African terms, in global terms, our financial markets are quite sophisticated. So that's just to say, but yeah, just on that point of us being the biggest economy, um, let's just remember that we might be the biggest economy, but that's the biggest amongst some very small economies. Relative to the US, we are still puny. We are still minuscule compared to the size of the US economy. We are less than 1% of global GDP. The US is between a quarter to a third of global GDP. So they are enormous relative to us. So they can do far more damage to us than we can do to them. Um, that's the first point. The second point is, why were we hit so much harder than a lot of the other sub-Saharan African countries? And that's basically the geopolitical strategy, as far as I can tell. I can't really see that it's grounded in much. I mean, U.S. companies certainly aren't threatened by us. U.S. industry certainly isn't threatened by South African exports, and there's not likely going to be any revenue. So the only other option is that they're seeking some sort of geopolitical concession. And there's been a lot of talk about that. There's certainly a lot of theories regarding what it is that the US expect from South Africa in order to lower that. But we've seen that President Trump is quite willing to use tariffs in order to get other concessions from countries. And as South Africa, we have to, as a country, we have to weigh up those costs versus the benefits. But again, you have to recognize the fact that the costs are going to be borne by South Africans, and the benefits of trade again is also borne by South Africans. So this really is the South African government deciding whether or not to benefit their own people by making certain concessions. And you have to keep that in mind, is that it's not the South African government trading with the US, it's South African companies asking to be allowed to trade with US companies and vice versa. And let's just always keep that in mind.
I think that's a pretty great point, especially as you said, it is the power aspects of the point you are making, and it is not governed by any economic reasoning whatsoever. So yeah, Dirk, we also I was hurt. Hopefully, I don't know about you back at home, but I was hurt to find out that we're no longer one of the biggest economies. So thank you for crushing my South African exceptionalism right there. What will I tell my other African sub-Saharan African friends in the north? I don't know. But on to the next question right here. We have a question from Ayanda, and Ayanda is asking that on a separate yet related question, right? Can relaxing our labor laws have a positive impact on our ability to be competitive in the manufacturing sector? So yeah, you can take that on.
Yeah, well, certainly, no doubt about it. One of the reasons that we are uncompetitive in global terms is the fact that we have let me just so that one of the reasons is that particularly when it comes to lower skilled and semi-skilled labor, those are quite high given the size of our economy. Lower skilled labor and semi-skilled labor in South Africa is, in global terms, actually quite expensive. The labor laws in South Africa have made it almost impossible for people on those more basic that deliver that more basic those are more basic labor functions, um, the unskilled or the semi-skilled. They've The labor laws have pushed those people out of the market. They've made it impossible to deliver those services in order to get or with the idea that if we legislate such a high floor, then eventually we'll all be able to have a very high standard of living, because we'll all be able to earn salaries and working conditions that people with relatively high educational attainment can generate. And that's why you can see when you look at the quarterly labor force, it's particularly people with less education also have less opportunities to get jobs. That's not. That's people tend to think that well, obviously you don't want to employ unskilled labor. You'd rather employ skilled labor or people that have an education. And then they say that we should educate more people. But the fact is, it's not a fait accompli that people with relatively low levels of education should be unemployed. Uh, Countries that have embraced a more dynamic and a more open labor environment, together with a more open trade environment, also make it possible for labor to become more competitive, especially if you're paying more for labor and you're paying more for inputs, then you just simply can't do business in South Africa. If you can fix either or preferably both of those issues, then you can really start to get the economy growing. And again, part of working is just getting that first step on the ladder, just getting that first job, which is eventually going to put you on the road to a better job and get your career going. But unfortunately, in South Africa, we've made it almost illegal to get that first job unless you're going to do it informally. And that is like I think it was Ayanda said, is it's related, but yeah, it's certainly related, even if that is a separate issue to trade in
Mhm.
particular.
Yeah, no, that's true. To I and hopefully he will be around for when I am doing my own presentation on the paper on regulations, because I'll be specifically dealing with labor regulations and their impacts on the South African economy. So that would be more fitting there. But I thought it was a great question because as it is related to trade, as you say, but it is not directly so. But it also does have an impact because in South Africa we are caught in the double quagmire of having high input costs and high labor costs, which results in the economic malaise we find ourselves in because, well, yeah, we have the highest unemployment rate in the world, and a majority of our working population is not working. I don't think people understand the implication of that. At least if you consider the expanded definition, or the majority of the youth, at least let me say that, right? Because the statistician in Morné won't let me get away with that. But I thought let us go. Let us go to another question. We have another one start from Dek Kodze. Dek, thank you for being super interactive in the chat. We appreciate you watching us. But this one is, if our foreign policy is the biggest aspects of these US tariffs, why is the ANC doubling down on it, even though the majority of South Africans don't agree with it? I think with this one, right, Morné, you kind of touched on it. It is related to the first question that, Dirk asked, because you mentioned how, even though there are no economic considerations being done here, South African leaders still have, one would who like them to have the principle of wanting to act in the best interest of South Africans and their companies, right? And whatever form of business that they may want to do with the United States. And as such, having that form of thinking is what should govern their interactions with this trade deal rather than looking for economic reasons. But of course, you are free to take this one, Morné.
Yeah, no, I think you said it well there. The only thing I would mention is, yeah, we do mention in the paper also that when you are talking about geopolitical considerations, then you are inherently excluding economic considerations from that. You are making political decisions, and those political decisions can be at the cost of or to the benefit of the economy, but they're not they are being made often without reference to the impact on the economy. Now, like I said, if you're the United States and you have a country that makes up quite a small proportion of your imports, then you have far more freedom to flex your muscles, or to, well, if you like, you can say to bully the smaller country, because it's not going to have as big an impact on your economy. If you're a small economy, you have to recognize the fact that um, particularly if you're a small economy growing at less than 1%, you've got very little to play with, and you have to really take into consideration that you do have an economy that's already struggling, and if you're going to make political decisions that undermine economic activity, then I mean that's coming at a far higher cost than the US equivalent, with reference to South Africa at least.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. I think that should be enough, at least for now, for the questions from the audience. Three is the magic number, and we appreciate every member of the audience for engaging with us. Of course, as always, we hope that you enjoyed Dr. Malan's presentation. I know I certainly did, because he covered all the multiple angles that you could think can be covered regarding this topic, especially focusing in on the what we can broadly and proudly say is the unsound basis upon which protectionism is argued for in the political sphere, that being the protection of local industries, showed how that is just simply not viable, or at the very least, it has the unseen effects of destroying capital allocation in the market, and every other thing he mentioned in the live stream. And of course, please do visit the Liberty First website. Don't forget to do that. There you will find various solutions that we at the Free Market Foundation have proposed to the South African state to change, the trajectory of South Africa's economy and general, life, really, so that it is on a much more prosperous road instead of the one to serfdom we are currently on. So please do visit the site, and also the link to Morné's paper was posted earlier on. It should be in the chat. Please do go read the paper. It is amazing, as always. And of course, if you're unsubscribed to the channel, make sure that you're subscribed. I mean, come on, we deliver such great content like this. Where else are you gonna find such an in-depth conversation about trade? So please do give us the honor of subscribing, hitting the notification bell, so that you do get a notification when we have live streams, or when you see, my ugly mug again on the YouTube channel talking about some other liberty-related news. And then, of course, again, thank you. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you, Dr. Malan. And any parting thoughts?
Thank you very much, Zex. It's been a pleasure. Maybe just one parting thought. At the end of the day, you can have one of two systems. You're either going to make decisions based on what central planners are deciding, or you're going to make decisions based on what prices are telling you. And I think prices they've unfortunately become like the ugly stepchild of economic policy. But people need to understand that whenever you're messing with prices, you're actually messing with a whole stream of information. Prices are these magical things that can tell you they can tell you something about scarcity, they can tell you something about preferences, they can tell you something about production and consumer choice and all those sorts of things. And anytime that any government official says we're going to start messing with that price mechanism, it actually means that they think that although they think that they can distort all that information, and that they actually know better than the cumulative effect of all of those various buying and selling activities. So just a final word in favor of prices. People should always appreciate prices. I don't think people recognize what a wonderful thing they are, even if sometimes it's you're not pleased by the price that you see at the shop.
That's true. That's true. I think it's a great parting point, right? The whole idea is that facts do not care about your feelings, right? It isn't the information that is problematic, it is your reaction to it. And politicians always do what you mentioned. Thank you for explaining prices and information, by the way. Hayek would be proud. But politicians always do that by wanting to mess with the price mechanism, as you say, meaning that they're uncomfortable with the information that the market is feeding them. And one would want at least our leaders to not react that way to information, but rather want to have as clear information as much as they possibly can so that they are able to make better, much more informed decisions. But that will be us. That will be all from us. Both me and Dr. Malan appreciate you joining us here. It has been amazing hosting you. I hope you had a great time listening to us and all that jibber jabber about you subscribing and liking the video and sharing it. Please do so again. And yeah, have a nice day. And always remember, stay